Sarah Martinez walked into the crowded bar wearing her civilian clothes, hoping for a quiet evening after months of grueling Army Ranger training. The small town of Cedar Falls wasn't used to seeing many outsiders, and she preferred to keep her military background private when she visited her hometown. The local bar buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd. Sarah ordered a soda and found a corner table, pulling out a book to read. She had changed since leaving for the military 2 years ago. Her once soft frame had been replaced by lean muscle, her reflexes sharpened to razor precision, and her confidence had grown through surviving some of the toughest training the military offered. 3 local men at the bar had been drinking heavily and noticed the unfamiliar face. Jake, the apparent leader of the group, was known around town for his aggressive behavior and picking fights with anyone he perceived as weak. He nudged his friends Tommy and Rick, pointing toward Sarah. "Look at that bookworm over there," Jake slurred, his voice carrying across the room. "Bet she's never done a hard day's work in her life. Probably some college girl thinking she's better than everyone here." Sarah heard the comment but continued reading, hoping they would lose interest. She had learned discipline and restraint during her training, understanding that real strength often meant knowing when not to fight. The Rangers had taught her that violence should always be the last resort. Jake's friends laughed at his comment, emboldened by the alcohol and their leader's bravado. They had grown up in this small town where showing toughness was everything, and they enjoyed intimidating newcomers. What they didn't know was that Sarah had just completed one of the most challenging military programs in the world. The bartender, an older man named Frank, had been watching the situation develop with concern. He had seen Jake and his friends cause trouble before, usually targeting people who seemed like easy marks. Sarah appeared small and quiet, exactly the type of person they typically bothered. As the evening progressed, Jake's comments became louder and more pointed. He made remarks about how city people were soft and wouldn't last a day doing real work. His friends joined in, creating a chorus of mockery directed at Sarah's table. Other patrons began to notice the brewing tension, some looking uncomfortable, while others seemed eager for entertainment. Sarah closed her book and took a deep breath. She had hoped to avoid confrontation, but the situation was escalating beyond her control. Her training had taught her to assess threats and plan multiple exit strategies. She quietly noted the positions of all 3 men, the location of exits and potential weapons in the environment. The irony wasn't lost on her. These men were mocking someone they assumed was weak, unaware that she had spent the last 6 months learning combat techniques that would make seasoned fighters nervous. She had crawled through mud, carried heavy packs for miles, and trained in hand-to-hand combat with some of the military's elite instructors. Jake finally stood up from his bar stool, swaying slightly as he turned toward Sarah's table. His friends followed suit, creating an intimidating wall of testosterone and poor judgment. The bar fell silent as other patrons sensed that something significant was about to happen. "Hey, bookworm," Jake called out, his voice dripping with false bravado. "Why don't you come over here and let us show you how real people have fun? Or are you too scared to leave your little safe space?" Sarah looked up from her book, meeting Jake's eyes with a calm stare that should have been his first warning. Her expression showed no fear, no anger, just the steady gaze of someone who had faced far more dangerous situations than a drunk bully in a small-town bar. She carefully placed her book on the table and stood up slowly, her movements controlled and purposeful. Sarah walked calmly toward the 3 men, her footsteps measured and confident. The crowd in the bar watched with anticipation, most expecting to see the quiet stranger either back down or get overwhelmed by the local troublemakers. Frank, the bartender, reached for his phone, ready to call for help if things got out of hand. "I'm just trying to have a peaceful evening," Sarah said in a steady voice, stopping a few feet away from Jake and his friends. "I don't want any trouble." Jake laughed mockingly, his friends joining in with cruel snickers. "Trouble? Lady, you don't even know what trouble looks like. Why don't you run along home before something bad happens?" Tommy, emboldened by the alcohol and his friend's encouragement, stepped closer to Sarah. "Yeah, this isn't a place for weaklings. Maybe you should stick to your books and leave the real world to people who can handle it." Sarah noticed how they positioned themselves, trying to box her in near the wall. It was a classic intimidation tactic, but they had no idea they were dealing with someone trained to handle multiple attackers in confined spaces. Her ranger instructors had put her through scenarios far more challenging than 3 drunk civilians. The tension in the room grew thicker as other patrons watched the confrontation unfold. Some pulled out their phones to record what they expected would be an embarrassing encounter for the young woman. A few regulars who knew Jake's history felt sorry for Sarah, assuming she was about to become another victim of his bullying. "Listen," Sarah tried one more time, her voice remaining calm despite the escalating situation. "I really don't want to fight. Why don't we all just go back to enjoying our evening?" Rick, the 3rd member of Jake's group, laughed loudly. "Fight? Who said anything about a fight? This would be like stepping on an ant. You couldn't fight your way out of a paper bag?" Jake nodded agreement, puffing out his chest with false confidence. "Exactly. This isn't even worth our time. But since you're here taking up space, maybe you should pay some kind of tax for using our bar." The comment about their bar made Sarah's jaw tighten slightly. She had served her country, defending the freedom of people exactly like these bullies, and now they were acting like they owned public spaces. Her training had taught her patience, but it had also taught her when patience became enabling bad behavior. "I'll pay for my drink and leave," Sarah offered, giving them one final chance to de-escalate the situation peacefully. No need for this to go any further. Jake's response was swift and foolish. "Too late for that, princess. You disrespected us by acting all high and mighty with your book and your attitude. Now you need to learn some manners." As Jake spoke, Tommy made his first mistake. He reached out to grab Sarah's arm, intending to intimidate her with physical contact. The moment his hand moved toward her, years of intensive training kicked in automatically. Sarah's body reacted before her conscious mind even processed the threat. In one fluid motion, she stepped to the side, avoiding Tommy's grasp while simultaneously grabbing his extended wrist. Using his own momentum against him, she applied a simple but effective joint lock that sent him stumbling forward into a nearby table. The movement was so quick and precise that most witnesses barely saw what happened. Tommy crashed into the table, sending glasses flying and landing hard on the floor. He looked up in shock, unable to understand how he had ended up there. The bar fell completely silent except for the sound of rolling glasses and Tommy's groans of confusion. Jake and Rick stared in disbelief, their alcohol-clouded minds struggling to process what they had just witnessed. Their friend, who was bigger and stronger than Sarah, was now sitting on the floor looking dazed and embarrassed. The dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically in a matter of seconds. Sarah remained in a relaxed but ready stance, her expression unchanged. "I asked nicely," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silent bar. "I really didn't want this to happen." Jake's face turned red with embarrassment and anger. The entire bar had just watched his friend get taken down by someone he had dismissed as weak. His reputation as the local tough guy was crumbling before his eyes, and alcohol made him too stupid to recognize the warning signs. "You got lucky," Jake snarled, clenching his fists. Tommy just slipped. "Let's see how you handle someone who's ready for you." Rick helped Tommy to his feet, both men looking shaken but trying to maintain their aggressive postures. Tommy rubbed his wrist where Sarah had applied the joint lock, still not entirely sure what had happened to him. The pain was real enough, though, and it was starting to cut through his drunken haze. Sarah sighed internally, recognizing that these men were too proud and too intoxicated to back down gracefully. Her instructors had warned her about situations like this, where de-escalation became impossible because of ego and alcohol. Sometimes the only way to end a confrontation was to finish it decisively. "Please don't make me do this," Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of genuine regret. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Jake interpreted her words as weakness rather than the warning they actually were. "Big talk from someone who sucker punched my friend. You think some fancy moves make you tough? I've been fighting since I was 12 years old." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that the real confrontation was about to begin. Some patrons moved toward the exits, while others positioned themselves for better views. Frank the bartender had his phone ready, though he was beginning to suspect that Sarah might not be the one who needed help. Jake threw the first real punch, a wild haymaker aimed at Sarah's head. To the untrained observers, it looked like a powerful blow that should have ended the fight immediately. But Sarah had faced military instructors who could throw punches that would make Jake's attempt look like a gentle pat. She ducked under the swing with minimal movement, letting Jake's momentum carry him forward off balance. As he stumbled past her, she delivered a precise elbow strike to his ribs. Not hard enough to cause serious injury, but sufficient to knock the wind out of him and send him stumbling toward the bar. Rick, seeing his leader in trouble, charged forward with his arms spread wide, trying to tackle Sarah to the ground. This was exactly the kind of attack she had trained against countless times. She sidestepped at the last second, grabbed Rick's shirt as he passed, and used his own momentum to guide him face first into the wall. The impact wasn't severe, but it was embarrassing and disorienting. Rick bounced off the wall and sat down hard, his nose bleeding slightly and his vision spinning. 2 down, 1 to go, and Sarah had barely broken a sweat. Tommy, still nursing his injured wrist, looked around desperately for something to even the odds. He grabbed a beer bottle from a nearby table, raising it threateningly above his head. The crowd gasped, realizing that the situation had escalated to potentially deadly weapons. "Tommy, don't," Frank the bartender called out, but his warning came too late. Tommy swung the bottle downward, aiming for Sarah's head. This was the moment her training truly showed its value. She had practiced defending against knife attacks, club attacks, and improvised weapons until her responses became instinctive. Sarah stepped forward instead of backward, getting inside Tommy's swing where the bottle couldn't build momentum. She caught his wrist with both hands, applied a sharp twist that made him drop the bottle, then swept his legs out from under him. Tommy hit the floor for the second time that evening, this time staying down. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds. 3 men who had entered the confrontation, confident in their ability to intimidate a young woman, were now scattered around the bar floor, nursing various injuries and their wounded pride. Sarah stood in the center of the chaos, breathing normally and looking completely composed. Her clothes weren't even wrinkled, and there wasn't a mark on her. The contrast between her calm demeanor and the chaos around her was striking to everyone present. The bar remained silent except for the groans of the 3 defeated men. Patrons stared in amazement, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Many had pulled out their phones and captured parts of the encounter, though the action had been so fast that most recordings would show little more than blurred motion. Frank the bartender slowly lowered his phone, realizing he wouldn't need to call for emergency services after all. The 3 troublemakers were conscious and moving, though clearly defeated and embarrassed. Sarah had used exactly the amount of force necessary to end the threat without causing serious injury. "Anyone else have a problem with me reading quietly in the corner?" Sarah asked the room, her voice carrying easily through the silence. When no one responded, she nodded and walked back toward her table to collect her book. Jake struggled to his feet, holding his ribs where Sarah's elbow had connected. His face was a mixture of pain, confusion, and humiliation. The entire bar had watched him and his friends get systematically dismantled by someone they had assumed was an easy target. "What are you?" Jake wheezed, still trying to catch his breath. "Some kind of martial arts expert?" Sarah paused at her table, considering how much to reveal. She had been taught to maintain operational security, but these men deserved to understand exactly how badly they had misjudged the situation. "Army Rangers," she said simply, picking up her book. "I just finished 6 months of combat training designed to turn soldiers into elite fighting machines. You 3 picked a fight with someone trained to handle armed terrorists and enemy combatants." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Suddenly, everything made sense. Sarah's calm confidence, her precise movements, and her ability to defeat 3 larger opponents without apparent effort. The crowd looked at Jake and his friends with a mixture of pity and amusement. Tommy sat on the floor holding his twice-injured wrist, finally understanding why nothing he had tried worked against Sarah. "We didn't know," he mumbled, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "You don't look like a soldier." "That's the point," Sarah replied calmly. "Real warriors don't need to advertise their capabilities to feel important. We know what we can do, and we only use those skills when absolutely necessary." Rick wiped blood from his nose and looked around the bar with embarrassment. Everyone was staring at him and his friends, but not with the respect they usually commanded through intimidation. Instead, people were shaking their heads in disbelief at their stupidity. An older man at the bar started to chuckle, then broke into full laughter. "You boys just got schooled by a ranger. Jake, You've been acting tough around here for years, and it took one little lady to show everyone what real toughness looks like." The laughter spread through the crowd as the tension finally broke. Patrons began talking excitedly about what they had witnessed, with many expressing admiration for Sarah's skills and restraint. Several people approached her table to thank her for not seriously hurting the three men, despite their aggressive behavior. Jake limped toward the door, his friends following behind him like wounded animals. Their reign of intimidation in the local bar had ended in spectacular fashion, and word would spread quickly through the small town about their humiliating defeat. "Wait," Sarah called out, stopping them before they reached the exit. The three men turned nervously, unsure what else she might have in store for them. "I hope you learned something tonight," she said, her tone surprisingly gentle. "Real strength isn't about picking on people you think are weaker than you. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves and using your abilities responsibly." Jake nodded reluctantly, some of his anger replaced by grudging respect. "Why didn't you just tell us you were military from the beginning? We would have left you alone." "Because I shouldn't have to wear a uniform or announce my credentials to be treated with basic respect," Sarah replied. "Every person in this bar deserved better treatment than what you three were offering." Frank the bartender approached Sarah's table with a fresh soda. "This one's on the house," he said with a grin. "That was the most excitement we've had in years, and you handled it perfectly. Those boys have been bullying people in here for months." Sarah accepted the drink gratefully. "I really did try to avoid the confrontation. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way." The three defeated men finally left the bar. Their departure met with scattered applause from the other patrons. The atmosphere immediately became more relaxed and friendly, as if a dark cloud had been lifted from the room. Word of the incident spread through Cedar Falls faster than a wildfire. By the next morning, everyone in town knew about the Army Ranger who had single-handedly defeated the three local bullies without breaking a sweat. The story grew with each telling, though most versions were surprisingly accurate thanks to the numerous phone recordings. Sarah had planned to leave town quietly after her brief visit, but the local response to the previous night's events changed her plans. People approached her on the street to shake her hand and thank her for standing up to Jake and his friends. Many shared stories of how the three men had intimidated them or their family members over the years. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who ran the local bakery, stopped Sarah outside the grocery store. "Dear, I wanted to thank you for what you did last night. Those boys have been terrorizing this town for too long and nobody felt they could do anything about it." "I was just defending myself," Sarah replied modestly. "I never intended for it to become such a big deal." "Well, it is a big deal to us," Mrs. Henderson insisted. "My grandson stopped going to that bar because Jake and his friends always picked on him. Maybe now he can enjoy a night out without worry." Similar conversations happened throughout the day. Sarah learned that Jake, Tommy, and Rick had been bullying various townspeople for years, using their reputation for violence to get their way in disputes and intimidate anyone they perceived as different or vulnerable. The local police chief, a veteran named Captain Rodriguez, found Sarah at the diner where she was having lunch. He sat down across from her with permission and smiled warmly. "I heard about last night," he said. "Wish I could have been there to see it. Those three have been trouble for years, but they were always careful to stay just barely within legal boundaries." "I hope I didn't cause problems for your department," Sarah replied. "I tried to handle it with minimal force," Captain Rodriguez laughed. "Problems? You solved more problems in 30 seconds than my department has managed in 3 years. Jake and his crew have been the source of dozens of complaints, but witnesses were always too scared to press charges." The conversation revealed the extent of the trio's reign of intimidation. They had been involved in bar fights, domestic disputes, and various forms of harassment that had made life miserable for numerous residents. Their defeat had given the community hope that change was possible. Later that afternoon, Sarah received an unexpected visit at her hotel. Jake stood outside her door looking nervous and holding his hat in his hands. His arrogant demeanor from the previous night had been replaced by something approaching humility. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly when Sarah opened the door. "I owe you an apology." Sarah invited him to sit in the hotel lobby where their conversation would be public and safe. Jake struggled to find words, clearly unaccustomed to admitting fault or showing vulnerability. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," Jake began slowly, "about real strength being used to protect people instead of hurting them. I guess I never thought about it that way before." "What changed your mind?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about his transformation. Jake was quiet for a long moment before answering. This morning, my little sister told me she was proud that someone finally stood up to me. She said she's been scared of me for years, wondering when I might turn my anger on her. I never realized how my behavior affected the people I care about. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Jake revealed that his aggressive behavior had started as a way to cope with his father's abandonment and his family's financial struggles. He had confused intimidation with respect and strength with cruelty. I don't expect forgiveness, Jake said as their talk concluded. But I want you to know that Tommy, Rick, and I have decided to change how we act around here. Maybe we can use our size to help people instead of scaring them. Sarah was impressed by his apparent sincerity. Change is always possible, she told him. It just takes courage to admit when you've been wrong and commitment to do better. As Jake left, Sarah reflected on how combat training had taught her about more than just fighting techniques. The Rangers had emphasized character development, leadership, and the responsibility that came with possessing dangerous skills. Sometimes the greatest victory was turning an enemy into an ally. 6 months later, Sarah returned to Cedar Falls during her military leave to visit family. The town had changed dramatically since her last visit, and the transformation was immediately apparent when she walked into Frank's bar for another quiet evening. The atmosphere was completely different from her previous visit. Families sat at tables enjoying dinner. Elderly couples played cards in corner booths, and young people socialized without fear or tension. The bar had become a welcoming community gathering place instead of a source of intimidation and conflict. Frank greeted Sarah with a huge smile and refused to let her pay for her drink. "You're a local hero," he declared. "Business has never been better since those troublemakers cleaned up their act." The changes extended far beyond the bar. Jake, Tommy, and Rick had kept their promise to reform their behavior. Jake had enrolled in anger management classes and started volunteering with a local youth program, using his experience to help troubled teenagers find better ways to handle their emotions. Tommy had joined the volunteer fire department, channeling his physical strength into helping people during emergencies. His injured wrist had healed completely, and he often told people about the night he learned the difference between real strength and fake toughness. Rick had started a small business doing yard work for elderly residents, often refusing payment from those who couldn't afford his services. His broken nose had healed with a slight crook that served as a permanent reminder of the consequences of bullying behavior. The 3 former bullies approached Sarah's table together, looking nervous but determined. The sight of them walking over would have terrified other patrons 6 months earlier, but now people barely looked up from their conversations. "We wanted to thank you," Jake said sincerely. "What happened that night changed all our lives for the better. We're not the same people who picked that fight with you." Sarah looked at each of them carefully, using her training to assess their body language and sincerity. Everything about their demeanor suggested genuine change rather than performance or manipulation. "I'm glad to hear that," Sarah replied, "but the credit belongs to you 3. I just provided a wake-up call." "You did the hard work of actually changing," Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "It wasn't easy. Took months to break old habits and learn new ways of thinking. But our families are proud of us now instead of embarrassed or scared." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the bar entrance. A group of rowdy college students had come in looking for trouble, clearly intending to cause the kind of problems that Jake's crew used to create. They were loud, aggressive, and already bothering other patrons. Sarah tensed slightly, prepared to intervene if necessary, but Jake held up his hand. "Let us handle this," he said quietly. "We owe this place some protection." The 3 reformed bullies approached the troublesome college students with calm confidence. Instead of matching aggression with aggression, they used de-escalation techniques they had learned through their personal development efforts. "Hey guys, welcome to Cedar Falls," Jake said in a friendly but firm tone. "We want everyone to have a good time here, but we need to keep things respectful for all the families and elderly folks enjoying their evening." The college students initially tried to maintain their aggressive postures, but they quickly realized they were outmatched physically and outnumbered by local support. More importantly, Jake's non-threatening approach made it difficult for them to justify escalating the confrontation. Within minutes, the situation was resolved peacefully. The college students either adjusted their behavior to fit the bar's welcoming atmosphere or decided to find entertainment elsewhere. No punches were thrown, no one was injured, and the evening continued smoothly. Sarah watched the interaction with pride and amazement. The three men who had once been the source of the bar's problems had become its protectors, using wisdom instead of violence to maintain peace. As the evening concluded, Sarah reflected on the unexpected consequences of that confrontation 6 months earlier. Her military training had prepared her to win fights, but it had also taught her that the greatest victories often came through changing hearts and minds, rather than defeating bodies. Frank approached her table as she prepared to leave. "You know, that night you came in here was the best thing that ever happened to this place. Not because of the fighting, but because of what came after." Sarah smiled as she gathered her things. Sometimes people just need to see that change is possible. Once Jake and his friends decided to become better men, everything else followed naturally. Walking out into the peaceful night air, Sarah felt satisfied knowing that her brief visit to Cedar Falls had created lasting positive change. The town had learned that real strength came from protecting others, not intimidating them, and that lesson would continue long after she returned to her military duties. The story that started with laughter and thrown punches had ended with transformation, redemption, and a community that had discovered the difference between fear and respect. Sarah's ranger training had taught her many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was that true warriors fought to create peace, not perpetuate conflict.